Greetings, fencers. So the next review will be on the Kvetun sword. So this review will be two parts. The first part will sort of be my story and specifically a review of my sword, but then the second part will be a more general idea of what Kvetuns are like, what they feel like compared to other swords, and examples with one of the other Kvetun swords in our club. So the reason I got a Kvetun was the SGT and Regenyei were definitely not equal, complete opposite sides of the spectrum. One person had to use a really heavy sword, the other person had got to use a really light sword. So I wanted to get something that was in between and wanted to try a new brand. So Kvetun had been getting tons of good reviews, so I decided to go with them from Johannes Heidner. You can find his contact information on Kvetun's website or at Sword Gear on Facebook. So I still remember my first heavy sparring session with the Kvetun, June 2019, longsword sparring. It's all on video. And after the sparring, I got a bend about at the last third of the blade and went a little bit off to the side. I'd seen that in reviews multiple times where people have said, oh, the sword bent at the tip, but we just bent it back and it was fine, continuing on. So I didn't think that much of it, but looking back, one thing you'll notice if you watch the sparring footage, I never got a thrust. The sword purely just bent from being hit on the flat, which is not a good sign. So eventually at one point in the video you can tell that the sword's not quite straight anymore, and I just sort of let it be and I didn't bother asking for warranty. That did end up being a mistake. So the sword then got used frequently at our club. Got used at Points North by Jacob. It just kept getting bent back and forth, and so now it very much has an S curve going up it at multiple points, and as you spar with it, it'll bend back and forth the other directions. Sometimes I'd grab it and it would look straight, sometimes I'd grab it and it would be complete bow if I bend it. So right now it does have a big bend at the tip, but if I just do one bend, you can see it's way off to the side. It should be going over my nose, and then I can bend it the other direction. And now it's almost straight. So it just bends back and forth constantly, and the one major problem, like one of the bad bend areas, was it actually got bent a little bit up from the shield. If I hold something straight up to it, you can see that the ruler isn't perfectly straight, but about here there's a bend, so that's just a little bit up from the shield. And at points I've picked up the sword and it's felt so off. It's felt like I don't know what I'm holding, because the bend's so low, it goes significantly off to the side, even if it's just a small amount off to the side. It feels like I'm holding something to the right of me. If you don't know that much about swords, it's my belief, I think most people would agree that a sword should not bend in the lower third, or even the lower half. It should be completely stiff that whole length. There should be no chance of a bend. And so that right there definitely means it was on them and there was a hardening issue, and it wasn't on us. And so this sword just bending back and forth, it was definitely not a properly made sword. There was definitely something wrong with it. And Kvetun, I've lost a little bit of trust because I also got a rapier, one of the strong rapier blades, and it bent 1 inch from the cross as well and just went off to the side. So in the ricasso it bent as well, which again, it should not be bending on the lower half. That's sort of a concern, and I've heard many stories of people getting swords that bent really easily and don't last that long. So there is definitely a problem with quality control. The consistency level of Kvetens is not the highest out of sword manufacturers. I hope that it's consistently getting better though, and that every year there's less and less percentage of swords that are improperly hardened, and hopefully 3 years from now the amount of swords is almost none. So is definitely a concern, and I was not happy with this sword. It did not last me that long. The last time I ever used it, I got a nice absets and thrust on someone, and it bent so much more than I had thought it would. There was a good maybe like 4 to 5 inches of deviation from where the tip should be. So I decided, you know, it's going to snap soon. We're not going to use it anymore. So now let's get into what actually makes a Kvetun sword different from other swords. They do have lots of good reviews, and lots of people are getting good swords, and their quality control is hopefully going up, and so you may want to choose this sword. We also have someone else who, even though we had this bent sword, he still got his own Kvetun, and he loves it. It works fine. He's had his sword for about 8 months, used it twice a week for sparring for most of that time, and has not had a bend, and the cord wrap also hasn't gone. You can see my leather wrap has had to be taped a lot. I generally prefer cord because I find it lasts a little bit longer. So what does it do differently? Well, starters, it is a flexible sword. So it has a nice good rounded tip, and the initial flex is significantly more than a stiff Regenyei that's even a touch longer. So if I bend the Kvetun one-handed and then the Regenyei one-handed, I have to push a lot harder in order to get the Regenyei to bend the amount of the Kvetun. It just effortlessly goes. And so it's definitely a sword that you don't have to worry about just thrusting people. You can just stick your sword out and it's going to bend effortlessly on them. The Regenyei, I have had people really get winded and knocked back, and you know, get some bruises and stuff, because sometimes swords just don't bend depending on how you thrusted, if they walk into it or something. So they both will reach big thrust, but the Kvetun on that initial thrust is effortless. The other part that separates a Kvetun from many other popular swords is it does have a slightly lighter point of balance. So it's just under 2.5 inches right at the shield. This has many pros. One, it's not going to hit people as hard, and two, it's going to be able to move the point a lot faster. You're going to be able to change through and also strike around significantly faster with your cuts. So a sword like this, if you're wanting to do a lot of cutting around type of combat, something like this will make that a lot easier. The strain on wrists will be a lot less in thwart cuts. The con with having a lighter sword though is I do find it a lot easier to get pushed offline. I'll definitely be trying to shoot the point or thrust in ox, and my point will just get hit aside. Also, when going in for a wrath cut, it's more easily that they will get the overbind as opposed to me getting the overbind. And so that does come at a cost, having that fast cut around speed, and that's why I do appreciate having swords with a higher point of balance and a bit more presence in the blade to really help those techniques finish, instead of giving up on the technique and just cut around, which is definitely the most common option in HEMA today. It also has a slightly longer handle, couple centimeters longer, and this allows a little bit more leverage action, again helping out with cutting around and with moving the point really fast. Alex from our club likes to do a lot of cutting around and also likes to do deceptions. Any type of flitting, failing, pulling will be a lot easier with a sword where the tip moves fast and you have a long enough handle to use that leverage capability. A Kvetun is also over 3.5 pounds, and so it's actually slower in full arm movements than the Regenyei. It's definitely noticeably heavier. It's also slower cutting one-handed and not super wieldy in that form. But when holding it for point movement, it's definitely noticeably faster and can sometimes feel lighter than the Regenyei in those instances. So overall, Kvetun is a good sword, and they do have great customer service. If you do need to get warranty, if you're under that time period, you can absolutely work with them. I was able to warranty the rapier blade easily. This sword is definitely a good training tool. You're going to be able to safely spar full speed without having to worry as much on slowing it down with control. It also still has that tapered grip, so for sparring gloves it's a lot easier to hold, and that big handle makes it so you're never going to have to worry about gloves, and you'll generally be able to get into your ox positions. Again, the only issue is just I find the consistency is a little bit less, but especially for Canadians, with it being so easy to get, you can buy it in stock from Sword Gear. It's definitely a good choice because it's cheaper than most swords out there at $4.50 with shipping roughly. Thanks for watching. Keep studying, keep practicing. It actually got bent a little bit up from the shield. Found it, okay. Give me. And so this sword, just bending back and forth, it was definitely not a properly made sword.